Very much, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Appropriations Bill 2019-2020. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable. It is also the true measure of a government. So let's have a look at the Coalition Government scorecard. Next month, going into their 7th year in office. How have they treated our most vulnerable Australians during their time in office? Older Australians are some of the most vulnerable in our community. We call them particularly the greatest generation, those who endured World War II and the Cold War challenges that came after. They showed courage, they came from parents that came through World War I and the Great Depression. A wonderful generation. Let's look at how the Coalition has looked after them. When the Labor Party declared that aged care in Australia was in a state of national crisis, the immediate response from Prime Minister Morrison was to accuse us of fear-mongering. Eventually, however, faced with scandal after scandal, Prime Minister Morrison was forced to concede that a Royal Commission was actually needed. But by then, the sector was at breaking point. South Australia's Oakden Aged Care Facility is just one of one that had been closed some 12 months before after horrific evidence of elder abuse and neglect was uncovered. And the Prime Minister made the announcement to hold a Royal Commission the day before the ABC show Four Corners was to air a 2-part investigation into the treatment of the elderly in aged care homes. So we see the master of spin before substance striking again, the great advertising person who is now our Prime Minister. So how did the aged care sector get to this point? Well, Deputy Speaker, the Coalition Government had been neglecting the aged care sector for 6 years. There were dozens of reports, reviews and inquiries about how to improve aged care, which were all left to gather dust on the shelf. And the number of older Australians waiting for their approved level of home care package was growing day by day under different ministers, well over 100,000 and still edging northwards. The government have had, basically governments, Labor or Liberal, have had 60 or 70 years to get the settings right, but the Coalition has got it very, very wrong. So they've cut almost $2 billion from residential aged care. No wonder the sector had hit crisis point. The Royal Commission has commenced hearings. Horrible stories of abuse and neglect are being heard. And while we wait for the Royal Commission to do its job and carefully collect evidence, older Australians across the country are still left vulnerable. There is more this government could do right now to protect older Australians. The Earl Haven Aged Care Facility on the Gold Coast was in the news recently. It had to close suddenly, leaving residents and their families frightened and distraught. There are many questions the government needs to answer about that closure. Did cuts to residential aged care funding contribute to the closure of Earl Haven Aged Care? Does the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner have strong enough powers to protect consumers? Are current regulations of residential aged care strong enough to stop this kind of event happening again? The recommendations that will come from the Royal Commission will be essential for the aged care sector going forward, but the Coalition Government cannot afford to sit on its hands waiting for these findings. This government has not done enough for vulnerable older Australians. They need to act so that older Australians can feel safe from abuse and neglect and secure knowing that they won't be thrown out onto the street at the will of a provider. In Australia, human dignity is seen as a birthright. We say Jack's as good as his master and perhaps maybe even better. We pride ourselves on not leaving anyone behind. It's a part of that core Australian value of mateship. And our welfare safety net is not an option, it's who we are as a country. It helps to define us. So for 6 years, the Coalition Government has done nothing to help the unemployed, except they've got a very good line in shaming the unemployed. If you have a go, you'll get a go is basically saying if you do not have a job, that is your decision. Or the best form of welfare is a job. Now, I agree that there is much dignity in labour, in employment. But what about those areas of Australia where if there aren't enough jobs for the number of unemployed people? That's not recognised by those opposite. And just yesterday we had the Minister for Employment releasing figures of how many unemployed people have had their payments suspended. It was offensive. It was an attempt to label the unemployed as dole-bludgers. I suggest you look at the hashtag to see what it's really like to be looking for work. I thought we were better than that as a nation. I thought even this cold-hearted Coalition Government was better than that. We know New Start needs to be increased immediately. Newstart is inadequate. It is, I would suggest, almost impossible to live on. There's no dignity in trying to get by on less than $40 a day. There's no dignity in being labelled a dole bludger. There's no, certainly when we have a Prime Minister who actually goes out and says, oh, no, all of those people on Newstart actually receive significant other payments. As it turns out, 52% of them only receive $1 extra a day. So if you pool that $14 over the fortnight, you might be able to get a burger and a milkshake if you're lucky. There's no dignity in being told those who have a go get a go when you're doing everything you possibly can to get a job and no one will actually give you a go. Deputy Speaker, the government's robo-debt scheme is so seriously malfunctioning that it is time for it to be scrapped. Their machine has gone rogue. 160,000 Australians have been hounded for debts they did not owe. The stress and hurt these claims have caused cannot be measured. As we've seen on the 7:30 report and other television shows, we've seen a mourning mother being hounded for an alleged debt owed by her deceased disability pensioner son. We see a widowed 79-year-old hounded for $67.55 from 1998 that he never actually owed. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare have reported that 429 Australians under 35 have died after receiving a robo-debt notice. Legitimate debts should obviously be claimed, but the robo-debt scheme uses a computerised calculation that is claiming false debts. There is no human oversight of these claims, it would seem. Once a claim has been sent, the recipient bears the onus of proof to establish that they do not owe any money. The onus of proof is effectively reverse. Some of these debts are many years old, and obtaining the historical documents to prove your innocence can be painstaking and sometimes impossible. Robo-debt is inaccurate, harsh and unfair. It is a cruel attack on some of our most vulnerable in society. It is the function of good governments to make sure that the processes they put in place are working and are appropriate and that the penalties are commensurate with the debt. Clearly, the robo-debt scheme fails that test, and it doesn't help having an incompetent minister administering it. Deputy Speaker, I have a very multicultural electorate with many people from who were born in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, about 20 of the 50 or so countries in Africa, people from all around, New Zealanders, people from all around the Pacific, all living in one part of the southern suburbs of Brisbane. Now, Moreton relies on connections with overseas. It's good for our business, it's good for trade opportunities and in so many ways. Now, because Moreton is such a multicultural seat, the most multicultural in Queensland, as you'd expect, many have family and friends overseas who often visit, and some who actually end up migrating. So my electorate has a large proportion of people who are well versed in dealing with the visa processing component of the Department of Home Affairs. And let me tell you, Deputy Speaker, many of them are alarmed by the Morrison Government's plans to privatise our visa system. Now, you don't hear too much about this scheme because the government knows that Australians don't like the privatisation of public assets and functions, especially in Queensland, especially one as critical as deciding who gets to come into our country. We know that if we don't get it right, we've seen 30,000 people arrive on planes and claim asylum under Minister Dutton, but under Minister Dutton's plan, private providers will be given licence to run Australia's visa system as a for-profit business. This could also lead to cuts to services, increased visa fraud and data security risks. Privatising our visa processing system could mean replacing most, if not all, visa processing workers with a fully automated process. Now, we know how well technology has worked for Centrelink's robo-debt system, don't we? Didn't go well at all. Would we trust that technology, the same technology that brought us robo-debt, with all of those complications and wrong calls, with actually issuing visas for the people that come into Australia? As one former Deputy Secretary of the Department said recently, what if the company that wins the bid to take over our visa system ends up transferring the visa processing work overseas? Now, this might save some costs, labour costs obviously, it's a big part of such a process, but what about the risk? I love this nation too much to risk our citizens' lives with someone outsourcing a project to the lowest possible bidder. especially if they go overseas. An Australian visa would be worth many times the annual salary of low-wage economy staff members. Would Australian taxpayers have to cover the additional cost to monitor, investigate anything if there's corruption? And we already have hints of corruption going on in our visa process now. Imagine if it's outsourced to a for-profit company, the one with the lowest cost, the lowest tender. And is the Australian public happy to take on such a risk, given our attitude to issues such as border control and visa integrity? We've already seen under this government over the last 3 years, we've seen it go from 9,000 people arriving claiming asylum at our airports, then up to 18,000 the year before, then up to 27,000 most recently. Minister Dutton has lost control of our airport processing procedures already, and we're going to see them try and outsource some of this visa processing. I believe in things like this. I think a little bit of economic nationalism is needed, Deputy Speaker, where we put Australian jobs and Australian security ahead of those the cold, hard economic decisions being trotted out by those opposite. It's not as if visa privatisation has worked out that well in countries where they have outsourced the system. Let's have a look at the United Kingdom, which privatised its system a few years ago. Let's see how well it's functioning there, a very comparable country with many connections to. We end up with, who would have thought in a for-profit operation, high fee charges, people being forced to travel hundreds of kilometres to be able to submit their applications, and some applicants having to pay for a premium service when the regular service was actually not available. So why is Prime Minister Morrison, a former immigration minister, hell-bent on going down this route? Well, I think it's because they don't believe in the provision of good services, and they would rather hand over control to one of our most vital services to the highest bidder, or the lowest bidder. Rather than a short-sighted sell-off, we need to upgrade our visa processing systems. We also need to make sure that the visa processing is owned, managed and operated by the Australian Government with Commonwealth staff, and that the staff are provided with the necessary resources needed for them to operate effectively. Australians don't want second-rate services, and it's too dangerous to outsource this. We want world-class services that will enrich our economy and make sure the jobs stay here. Deputy Speaker, we know this coalition government has made cuts to many services, vital services in this country. I take your mind back to that shocking Joe Hockey budget, that first line-up of cuts, and then the big, what we actually see opposite is big cuts done quietly and then little loud handouts. That's the way they operate, whether it be in environment, whether it be in local infrastructure, whether it be in education. Now I'm going to focus on education the time remaining. They're not prepared to spend big money providing actual services that will make the lives of all Australians better. That would cost money that might endanger their precious surplus target. But being an advertising man, the Prime Minister knows that when you have a dud product, you need to distract with something bright and shiny. It's a classic marketing trick. Turn on the television any day of the week and you'll see it in action, especially late at night, where you can get a set of steak knives if you buy something. Buy one and get one free, all that sort of thing. Now, there's nothing wrong with steak knives. They're useful and people generally want them. I know, as the son of a butcher, that's the trick. But they're a sweetener to buy the dud product. The Morrison Government has turned itself into a late-night Demtel classic daytime television spruiker. It's cut funding to actual education, but is giving away trinkets to schools as a sweetener. I'm referring to the grant funding for local schools. Don't get me wrong, I encourage all my schools in Moreton to apply for these grants of between $1,000 and $20,000. But although some schools will get something, some of my 50 schools will get something, but what they won't get is more funding to support them to better provide the education they want their students to have and their students deserve. They'll get some shade sales, but what about having 7 teacher aides? They'll get some shade cloth, but what about having 7 teacher aides who can actually make a difference? The same could be said for the Morrison Government's Community Environment Program. The government has no policy to address climate change, none at all, and so they give trinkets of funding to community-led environmental projects. Local community and environment groups can apply for funding of between $2,500 and $20,000 for eligible projects. As I said, big cuts done quietly and little loud handouts. That's the way they operate. Again, I'll be encouraging all of my local environment groups to apply for this funding, but it's not addressing the actual problem of rising emissions and the devastation that will be caused by this government's lack of action. This is a smoke and mirrors government. They use every marketing trick in the book to try to look like a government, but you hardly need to scratch the surface to find the true beast, a shonky salesman trying to sell a mirage.
The honourable member's time has expired and I call